Okay, I think I'm running on whatever channel I am running on. Who knows? Given the weirdness of last week and what name address the computer thought I was. So it's either going to be the current one from last week or my regular channel. I'm betting that it's the stopgap one, but we'll find out. Anyway, everybody that's subscribed will get this wherever this lands, hopefully, and we will see what we are doing. So we are, as usual, plowing along through Titans, the Creationist Dinosaur book by Sarfati and Tay. And bless their little hearts, we are now concluding the Pterosaur, the ends of the Pterosaur section and this particular chapter. The next one will be relating to the exciting world of dinosaur diet, where we will see whether or not they manage to get any better in terms of that. They've already thrown in the towel on herbivory versus carnivory, so I'm not expecting any real surprises on that little front. And of course, the other part of the show is that this is our bi-weekly assault on the KC Luskin 800 plus papers. Spoiler alert, still nothing new to help their cause, but interesting information that pops up under the why the hell did they think to bring this up category. Anyway, so again, we're pulling up the end of the Pterosaur section and the chapter. He's still going on. They're still going on about Richard Dawkins that we noted last time. And so they're making a big deal of a paper from 2010 by Lu et al., which we'll be putting up as an open access link, on Darwinopterus, a derived pterosaur that suggested a more complex origin story to their skull shape, which is instead of the kind of short rhamphorhynchids, the longer pterodactyloid style, and that this didn't help the model in older theories like Maynard Smith, who, by the way, isn't even mentioned in the Lu paper. So it indicates that this is kind of not a current topic by 2010. At any rate, the older model that Maynard Smith was dealing with had expected longer and shorter tail length to be diagnostic characteristics. Well, of course, this pterodactyl is coming in the Jurassic, not the Triassic, so it's well after the origin of things. And the model had expected that these longer skulls had evolved in forms with shortening tails rather than developing in forms that already had long tails and had stuck with them, which is what turned out to be the case with this Darwinopterus. So yeah, it changed a little bit of their dynamics. But it was clear from this one long tail one that the skull elongation could occur independent of that, and it suggested ecological adaptations as to the shape of the skull. That's fine and dandy from 2010. Now, S&T really overplayed this paper, asserting that the Lu, air quote, modules approach, unquote, relating to skull evolution, quote, goes against Dawkins's Darwinian gradualism, unquote. Bum, bum, bum. No. Absolutely nothing in the paper justified that conclusion jump, especially as the phases they posit, two main phases of variation, and they had a whole bunch of critters that they were able to put in the chart. In fact, let's see what we got going in here. This is the evidence for modular evolution paper that I'll be putting the linkage up to. And they had a really nice little breakdown chart of their evolutionary phases of what's going on in terms of the shape and structure of things, and a whole bunch of taxa, which of course our little pals at Young Earth Creationism land are paying no attention to whatsoever. So you can take a look at all of that stuff. The time frame involved is like 20 million years. This is not an eye blink. And of course, you'd still have all of that biogeographical information as to why the rhamphorhynchids are coming up initially, showing up in all what is supposedly the same mushed together flood deposit as with eagles and anomalocarids and anything else. We never find the kind of mishmash mixing that would be perfectly understandable if all of this had taken place over a relatively short period of time. And Sarfati and Tay are going nowhere near trying to make any sense out of all of this stuff. Anyway, the paper's initial concept was that Darwinopterus was an aerial predator. And that actually didn't fare very well in the years to come, which presumably S&T didn't bother to look into. A subsequent finds and study and a paper not cited by S&T favors a ground environment for them. Wang et al. 2017, which we will be also putting up as link. This is on Dugenopterus, a fossil whose shorter tail was, quote, reducing the gap between long and short-necked pterosaurs. So this will be the 2017 paper, and boy, does it also have a great deal on the various phylogeny data and taxa involved. So I pegged this one under the category of oopsie doodle, but the data field is not supporting their argument. Remember, we went in previous episodes about the fossil data in relation to the origin of pterosaurs and the like, which again is not being discussed in Sarfati and Tay. So it's very much little tunnel vision mode. The last technical paper in the chapter is one from 2022 by Gutara on the evolution of body mass in marine tetrapods. And that, again, sure looks like evolutionary adaptations to me. And you may also be able to notice the phylogeny data that are in that paper, against which young Earth creationism has absolutely nothing to offer, and including Sarfati, who riffed off it again in 2022 in a creation.com article, which is listed in the Sarfati and Tay book without giving any additional material. So basically, it's double down, triple down, and avoid the data field as much as possible. Part 2, then, is our cute little world of Luskin's 800 papers. Alan Hebert 2021 is a perspective on Z-RNA, which is a naturally occurring left-handed twist of RNA. And there's also a Z-DNA too, that found to play a role in some biology. I suspect that part of the trigger for the bunch, McClatchy and Luskin and all the rest, to latch onto this. We don't have any great detail in the Luskin list as to who exactly picked out which stuff. They're not in alphabetical order. It's just a mishmash, so people were presumably offering their blobs of information, and it was getting folded into this big posting that ended up on the Discover Institute. But no details on things. So you just have to go down through them one at a time, as we are doing. Anyway, in that abstract of that paper, which I'll be putting a link up to, it's from PLOS Genetics, so it's open access. Quote, by enabling self-recognition, ALU retrotransposons, once invaders, now are genetic elements that keep immune responses in check, unquote, which would be perfectly fine indication that there are some functionalities to ALUs, which we already knew. Few percentage points. Yep, no doubt about it. Nothing, of course, in the work is connecting up with the idea that most ALUs are that way. And in fact, this whole Z-RNA issue is one they really shouldn't have brought up. It's possible for viral pathogens to trick the Z-RNA into thinking it's self rather than invader. And so the conclusion of that 2021 paper was the co-option of ALU retrotransposons to mark self is a remarkable example of how genomes evolve existential threats into something essential for their survival. In the case of MDA5, ALU Z-flipons switch innate immune responses off, which means what you've got is something going on with ALUs that the system has come to adapt and use positively in favor. And we already have pointed out before how the ALUs can cross-connect with each other and they can form linkages quite easily. And so the biology in some limited cases has worked quite nicely to deal with that. So you have to bring up the notion of what exactly do they mean by existential threat? And that turned out to have been a paper from 2019 by the same author, Herbert, who has been researching this for years and years and years. And we'll be putting a link up to that as well, which was delving into how Z-DNA and Z-RNA figure in human disease and how Z-forming sites, quote, likely limits invasion of primate genomes by ALU retrotransposons. Now, Luskin and company could theoretically have known of that paper too, because it was cited by Herbert directly in the 2021 paper, but poof, doesn't show up. And in fact, not a single one of the other papers on the list mention Z-DNA, Z-RNA at all. It's just not a topic. So they just latched onto this one little paper, which is clearly bumping into the theodicy issue. And so does the one that they don't deal with, the 2019 paper. So we're still at the same boundary layer. Sorry to Peter and others that have been watching the show to think, my gosh, how horrifyingly boring all of this is, because we're never getting any indication that there's any functional retrotransposons and junk DNA other than what we already knew is the case. Now, even if you can manage over the years to double the amount of actual examples from the sorts that Danstrom Cardinale has mentioned in his material, you still wouldn't be anywhere to that 50% level, which was kind of like the redress that Casey Luskin threw out as a value that it was kind of maybe aiming for, as opposed to what they do in their public apologetics, which is functionally thinking that all of it is functional, or virtually all of it is functional. Ross takes exactly the same. Fazal Rana and others are taking exactly the same position. But they've all kind of had to backpedal in one way or another, that the fact that the data doesn't support that contention, which of course is Danstrom Cardinale's position. So there we are. I'm not seeing anybody in the chat, so I'm fearful that we're probably on the same old channel that was that sidebar channel. But such is life. Everybody that's going to have to kind of, I keep posting the linkage to the material on both Twitter and Blue Sky, so that everybody will be familiar with it. So what it'll have to be is people that are unaware of it are going to have to make sure that they're subscribed to this version, just in case the subscription to the other version isn't bringing them in on it. What can I do? It was enough of a fuss to get the laptop, or rather restream on the laptop, to recognize that I was who I was, and so that I could actually get the show off the road and not start from scratch. So anyway, what can I do? I'll also have to comment on the thing in the news relating to what the Trump administration, or rather Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, did in their absolutely pathetic, scurrilous hit job attack mode argument with Zelensky in the Oval Office, surrounded by the flak and all of their media. They were obviously trying to push this onto something. It was absolutely pathetic and disgraceful. Zelensky then went over to the Europeans, who warmly welcomed him. And I'm hoping that the end result of this is that the attempt for Trump to try to extort repayment from Ukraine by getting control of their lithium resources, I hope they give that to the bloody Europeans and make it a part of getting into the European Union and NATO. It's a reprehensible circumstance of what's going on in the Trump administration. And remember, we've only got a few more months in that before we hit the fall. And I'm thinking we're in 1929 mode. And then things are going to get very murky indeed. Even as it is, you've got a bunch of really pissed off grassroots Republicans who are not at all pleased with what they're seeing from Elon Musk and all the rest. And that's making life miserable for an awful lot of Trumpista congressmen when they try to go back and do town hall meetings. And that's still in relatively good economic times. When we hit the fan hitting episode that I suspect is going to be happening on a bunch of fronts, all of that goodwill or semi-goodwill is going to vaporize. And it's going to be a very, very murky time and an interesting time as we slide into 2026, 2027, 2028. What extremist, crazy train stuff that they're going to do. Musk, of course, is feathering his own nest. He's maneuvered a big contract for himself to take over aspects of the air traffic control system. The idea that there's not a conflict of interest in this area is a thing that only a Donald Trump-style oblivious nitwit could manage to avoid. So there we go. What can I say? Let me put up my patrons to remind everybody about how much I appreciate what goes on out in the hinterland. And may I remind everybody that in the coming potential screwball bad economic times, those who can no longer support the project, I will be well aware that that is certainly an option. You got to look after your own finances in that first. But everybody who is sticking with us all the way, I very much appreciate it, and it makes a difference every single month. Just as my little trickle of book royalties and all the rest. Most of my income is Social Security, which for the moment is still kicking in. And you can just imagine the panic-stricken thing that would be occurring if the Trumpists just try to pull the rug out from under a lot of that, although Musk just called it the Social Security system a Ponzi scheme. And this is from an administration that is actively sidling up to crypto and Bitcoin and all of that, which is in an unregulated mode probably going to be one of the things that's going to vaporize in the coming crash, and it's going to take a whole bunch of. So I hope Joe Rogan and others are heavily invested in the stock market and crypto so that they'll get burned to shreds, to a cinder in that mode. So anyway, what an exciting little world we got going on here. Anyway, nobody in the chat group, so I'm assuming again it's because I'm on this weird old version channel. I'll try to remedy that as much as possible through letting everybody know that it's on a different thing, and they got to make sure that they're subscribed so they can catch up. We will see. So we got all that material in. I'll give you a heads up on the continuing work that I'm doing on chapter on the cosmology stuff for Volume 2. Oh, it's an interesting area. I confess, as a historian, cosmology issues have not been my major area. And I'm not a physicist. I don't have the training to go into all the little ins and outs of the very abstruse little formulas and differential equations and that get lobbed around by people at the higher echelon levels, including coming from like Halton, Arp, Cap, and all of that are the opponents of the Big Bang currently. But nonetheless, I can evaluate what the state of the art is and keep up with technical literature, and which I've been trying to do assiduously to pile in on a lot of different issues. We're going to be discussing stuff on the nature of dark matter, dark energy, and some of the old canards that have kind of disappeared from most creationist apologetics, but used to be a big thing in the old days, like the shrinking sun, which Kent Hovind still pushes every now and then, the missing neutrino issue. Both the shrinking sun and the missing neutrino state have reached the point where like CMI and AIG have had to slip in little caveats into some of the postings they still have up saying, you really shouldn't use this anymore because he's not really true. Oops. But yet, so if you find a creationist that's still pushing some of these little arguments, it's because, boy, they haven't kept up with the Joneses on this matter and are relying on older material. It's a very compartmentalized field as well, because you have little cliques and niches in this area. They're not a huge number of creationist technical trained people, Jason Lyle and Hartnett and maybe a handful others, that basically are the point people producing the apologetics at CMI, ICR, AIG, and to some extent at Creation Research Journal and all that, Creation Research Society Quarterly. And so it's a very, very small club with a certain amount of backbiting detailing going on. And so there's no consensus view of why the Big Bang is not supposed to be a thing. Theoretically, even a young Earth creationist could accept the Big Bang as a starting point. They could just scrunch it down into the existing framework. But too much of it is connected up with a standard physics thing. One of the things that we'll be calling attention to in the new book is the hypocrisy of some of the ones, which include Henry Morris and Duane Gish and that, who would be waving Halton Arp and Eric Lerner and others and criticizing the Big Bang when their steady state style universe isn't friendly to the young Earth creationists either. And they don't go out of their way to call attention to that. Then, of course, the rest of the chapter will be dealing with the whole slew of things about solar system formation and bits about why the planets are the way they are. There's a big blob of creationist apologetics that cycle around to kind of the same kind of drains over and over again. We'll be talking about the lunar dust myth that was old Henry Morris canard. We'll be discussing a bunch of stuff connecting to Kent Hovind and his Hovind theory, which is just a retread of kind of vapor canopy thing, except with ice crystals. We'll be bringing up some interesting stuff. The Oklo nuclear reactor, the prehistoric nuclear reactor from the Precambrian, will be coming up in that area. The World War II airplane that sank into the Greenland ice, that's going to be discussed in that chapter. Polonium halos, that's going to be another little sidebar in the chapter. So there's going to be an awful lot of really fun stuff to bring everybody up to speed on who's saying what and who's not saying what in the cosmology field. And then after that, my other chapter that I'll be the major writer on is the material on the Ark Encounter Kinds list, which I think will be a useful measure for anybody in this field, because it will put in a clear, concise way what exactly the creationists are contending in terms of kinds aboard the Ark, and how that fits in with other creationist views. You get some disputes about which one's which. They can kind of go most of the way with families, but there are some confusions because systematics changes the details, and there's some things which might have been regarded as a family, but now are regarded like subfamilies within a larger category. Do you move the kind around to accommodate that? Hard to say, because most of the creationists are too far behind the curve on these little details, or they just leave sections out. Sarfati and Tay leave a whole slew stuff out, as we pointed out in previous examples. The Answers in Genesis crowd are fairly assiduous in this area, and wiffle-waffly, because they include the mammal-like reptiles as kind of reptiles. So they're sort of having that whole transition right there in front of you, but yet they treat them all as separate kinds. But the fun part will be the fact that they're not presenting them in alphabetical order. Even within the subgroups, they're not in alphabetical order, which would make no sense at all, since no kind can ever be related to any other kind by definition. Why not put them in alphabetically? And the fact that they don't do that forces us to look at why they're in the order that they are. And at that point, particularly with mammals, it turns out they're just doing them in the order that evolutionary systematics has cataloged them. So they're giving the game away that there's a degree of parasitism into how they were assembling their kinds list. And to be fair, Answers in Genesis is the Ark Encounter is really distinctive for having so few kinds aboard the Ark. By sticking with vertebrate animal families, they can whittle it down to 1,400. And that means there's theoretically enough space, especially if they go with little babies, and they can get them on the Ark, kind of, sort of. They still have the problem of the proliferation and the fact that at that level, they've got 54% of them dropping dead after the Ark lands, which means, boy, what a really incompetent, not very successful preservation mechanism this was. The whole point of putting the animals on the Ark, they could have left all the dinosaurs off if they were only going to become extinct. There's just a muck of sidebar issues in there. And of course, there's the whole missing issue in baraminology for all those invertebrates and insects, all of that stuff that's marine invertebrates that are a colossal amount of life that are probably never going to get processed, because there's just so many taxa, and trying to weasel their way through them without bumping into the evolutionary systematics that connect these groups. I don't think they can ever pull it off, because they can't even do it terribly well with the limited number of stuff. Remember, the animal life that we're represented by mammals and even reptiles are a relatively small number. I mean, you've got with birds, you've got somewhat 9,000-10,000 species. You got thousands of species of mammals altogether, but too many to put on the Ark, but not much relation to the vastly larger groups of these invertebrates, where you have hundreds of thousands of species, not tens of thousands. That's just a hard work level of deck chair shuffling that I don't think creationists are ever going to pull off, temperamentally or factually. So anyway, we're almost up on a half an hour. Let me put my advert up on the thing. Again, not seeing anybody in the overlay, so I'm assuming that nobody from the previous things are spotting me on the show is live thing. I'll hope that we can redress that in the coming weeks. Let me get my little rocks advert going here. Come. And anyway, it is going to be an interesting time for everybody in the months and years to come. And I hope we can weather it. We weathered worse. We weathered the Great Depression and World War II. Weathered the Civil War with bumps and grinds. And remember, there are way more of us than there are of Trumpistas. They've shown even in the 2024 election, most voters did not vote for Trump. They squeaked through as being the lead, more votes than Harris, but nonetheless still didn't quite reach 50%. And that balance has every reason to change drastically when even to the most die-hard Trumpista, they realize that their policies are catastrophically bad for them personally. And when it hits them in their pocket, from unemployment to inflation, that becomes a matter that it takes only the most extreme mind to be able to rationalize around. We'll see. It's going to be an interesting experiment. Plus, it'll give Marketplace an opportunity on PBS, NPR to investigate an economy crashing into depression, and we'll be able to see how well other countries do or do not operate. We have a European Union now instead of a disconnected set of states as it was in the 1930s, and very possibly sounder policies in these various states, although you do have drags of Erdogan in Turkey and who was in NATO, and Orban, the little authoritarian thug. Trumpistas just love him because they love thugs. But it's going to be an interesting and exciting time. And if we can manage to squeak through this without it becoming a global depression and a horrifying world war, then maybe we can have some positive benefits coming out of all of this. We'll see. It's going to be an interesting time to be alive in that curse level. May you live in interesting times. So anyway, thank you very much for whoever may be watching this or not, and whoever may be watching this eventually as they encounter it. Again, I'll try to alert everybody that this is probably on that wacky little old channel, and everyone will need to resubscribe to get up to speed on this. So anyway, ending the stream, and we will